We are going to start this section by discussing various technologies that exist for creating memory and the trade-off between these technologies.
So the first thing that I want to talk about is, when we think about memory, what is it that we care about? Semiconductor industry has been dealing forever with a big dilemma when it comes to designing memory. And it's really the fact that we have to make a trade-off between three different criteria that we like to have, but we haven't been able to have all of them at the same time. The criteria that we care about are, like always, cost. When we talk about cost, it's really about the cost per unit of memory provided. We also want our total capacity to be high. We want to have a lot of memory to keep more data and more instructions in the memory. And of course, the other thing we care about is speed. We want to be able to access the memory, write, and read to it very, very quickly. As it turns out, though, these three goals have been sort of competing with each other. We have been able to create systems that achieve, some of them perfectly, but at the expense of the other ones. And that's the dilemma that the industry has been dealing with. There is no perfect solution yet. There are some solutions that have been designed over the years, and that's what we are going to be discussing in this chapter. So let me give you some examples of these trade-offs as exist today. Okay, so the main technologies for sort of keeping data in some sort of memory, you have learned about several of them. The first one I wanted to discuss is registers. A register is a form of a memory. The register file, you can think of it as memory. It's completely valid. Now, what are the properties of the registers? Well, in terms of their speed, they are the best possible kind of memory. They are extremely fast. Their capacity is extremely low, right? You can't keep much data. We had only 32 registers in ARM, for example. Some architectures have more, but not tremendously more. Their cost, with respect to per unit of the memory that you create, is not that low, right? So it's not that cheap. That's why we can't create a lot of it. So cost and capacity are kind of going to be tied together in many ways. The next thing after registers are SRAMs. SRAM is what's called the static RAM. We will learn about caches and things like that in this chapter. A lot of time, those are implemented with SRAMs. A static RAM is not super different from, in terms of the technology, is not that different from the registers. There are some differences between them, and its properties is kind of also similar. So in terms of speed, SRAM is good. Maybe even I can write great. It's quite great. In terms of its capacity, I'm going to change register to say lowest because you can't get less than registers have. SRAM is better, but it's not great. So I'm going to just write low, right? So here we're talking about 32 registers. In terms of SRAM, machines these days might, for example, various caches, they might have, kilobytes of SRAM. So that's sort of the size we are talking about. Maybe tens of kilobytes, maybe hundreds of kilobytes. In terms of cost, it's not very cheap. So creating a lot of it is not easy. The next technology to consider is DRAMs. DRAMs, when you talk about the RAM in your laptop or whatever, even in your phones, when you talk about how much memory your machine has, you're usually talking about the DRAM. So when you say my machine is an 8 gigabyte RAM, it's usually implemented with this DRAM technology, dynamic RAMs. They are, in terms of cost, quite okay. They are not too bad. You can get a lot of them, gigabytes of them for for hundreds of dollars. For maybe $100, you can get many gigabytes of DRAM. The capacity is good. Like I just said, machines these days easily can have 16 gigabyte RAM. In my lab, we have machines that have 300 gigabytes of RAM. In the supercomputing center at UCSD, you have machines that have a little bit more than 1 terabyte of RAM. So it's the capacity is quite good. The speed is okay. It's not nearly as good as SRAM and registers. In fact, it's much worse. Uh, but even though the memory speed is much worse than SRAM and register, working with it's memory is still not by far the worst. The worst place you can keep your data and access it is hard drive. In terms of speed, is the worst. Just to give you some idea, if accessing registers takes less than a nanosecond, I think these days it does. Accessing a hard drive would take milliseconds, right? So it's many orders of magnitude slower. The capacity is the best. You can, for very little amount of money these days, you can easily go to your to anywhere and buy terabytes of hard drive, many terabytes, very easily. And so the cost is really low. Now, hard drives are not homogeneous these days. There are two main forms of it that have been developed: solid state and the magnetic drives. Solid states have been around for a while. Solid state is a lot better in terms of speed compared to hard drive, but so it's not nearly as bad, but it still is not good as all these other forms. Now, you notice the trade-off, right? We either have good speed but low capacity over here. We have okay speed and okay capacity over here, and we have bad speed and high capacity over there. What we want is, of course, high speed and high capacity. This chapter is all about can we use some smart techniques to create a system where it kind of has the benefits of high speed that you get from registers and SRAMs, but also with the kind of capacity that you would get from, let's say, hard drives or DRAM. And that's what we are going to try to accomplish using the concept of memory hierarchies, which we'll learn about.